Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. I'm Isabel Wong, a financial journalist who wants to uncover the many Asian stories around us that are waiting to be told. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Kopal Manglik, an Indian writer who was born in Delhi and raised in Hong Kong from age 10. Having been battling bipolar disorder since age 17, Kopal talks to us about finding the right therapist and organizational psychology. Welcome back to Proudly Asian. Well, last week we took a brief break because October has just been so crazy for many of us. And for this episode, we are going to continue the Mental Health Day special series that we rolled out in October because a lot of you have reached out telling us that the episodes we released so far around Mental Health Day are so relevant to so many of you. And a lot of you also said that you were able to get some practical tips on how to manage certain stressful situations in life. So I'm so pleased to bring in Kopal for this episode to continue the whole conversation. So welcome to Proudly Asian, Kopal. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Isabel. Super excited.
Yes, I'm so excited to be talking about the areas that you study, which we'll touch on later. And also you recently have another article published on Vice, and we're going to deep dive into that a little bit later. But first thing first, to have our listeners get to know a little bit more about your background, why don't we start with a question that I ask every single guest of mine who comes on Proudly Asian, which is, who are you? What are you? And where did you grow up?
Oh, wow. Where do we even start with these questions, right?
I know.
Especially as third culture kids. So I am Kopal. I was born in India, but I grew up in Hong Kong. We moved here when I was about 10 years old, and I've lived here since. I did my master's, which we'll also talk about in a bit, in New York and I was there for 3 years, and I ran back to Hong Kong before COVID hit. One of my best decisions. So that's, I guess, me in terms of location, just a place where I am and where I've been. But I guess as a individual, I am currently a writer. I've gone through a lot of different career changes, but I write for some local magazines, and I also write for companies. So sort of their blogs and websites and press releases. I'm a copywriter, and I am super passionate about, I'm about mental health. I'm passionate about animals. I'm passionate about sustainability. So it's a wide spectrum. Basically anything that seems to be doing good to the world is what I'm interested in.
And just a follow-up question about your backgrounds, right? You moved to Hong Kong when you were 10, is that correct?
Yeah.
And just wondering, for a 10-year-old Kopal, was it hard for you to navigate a new city when, you're going through your early teen years?
Absolutely. It was quite challenging. I think coming from, especially in terms of schooling, I think coming from a specific type of schooling where in India, it's a lot more about rote learning and sort of a lot more tests and things like that. And moving to an ESF school here, which was very free flow. And it was like, come sit on the carpet, we'll read a book together. So it was a little bit all over the place. And this is a story that's going to be released soon. But I remember this was in my first year, and I was made the lunch monitor at school. And then I'd created this beautiful little, I don't know what to call it, I guess, a chart with who's going to take care of what, when, and what's going to happen. And then I wrote tiffin, which is a very Indian word for lunchbox. Well, it's originally colonially English, but it's something that's used in India a lot. And then I'd written it down, and then I was showing off sort of the chart that I'd created, and one of the kids asked, he was like, "What's a tiffin?" And I remember how my stomach dropped. I was like, "Oh shit, I've made a mistake." And then the teacher sort of got explaining, and she asked, I think, one of the students to do a little bit of background research. And then the student came back and was explaining what a tiffin is. And I was just sitting in my corner, red as a beet, going, no. And then I went back and I went home and I just like changed, crossed it out, made it again, put lunchbox everywhere.
Oh.
Yeah, that was little me when she'd first moved. But I think today I'm at a point where I'd be able to embrace the word tiffin as well
Yeah.
as lunchbox.
Yeah, definitely. I guess for those early years at school, it's always quite scary for us to navigate because, like, the idea of being a bit different or knowing something
Yeah.
different was just so scary. But then these days, I'm really hoping that conversation has opened up a bit about, embracing differences in the current education system.
Yeah.
But I mean, I know that also during your teenage years, it wasn't the easiest period of your life because you began having some depression episodes. Could you tell us about that period of your life? How did you feel? What happened?
Yeah, absolutely. It was right after GCSE. For those who might not know, GCSE is your sort of pre-final years exam. It happens in year 10 and 11. And for 14, 15-year-old me, that was like the biggest thing ever. It was like, I have to ace this. Otherwise, my life is not going to my life was going to go down the drain. And then right after my GCSEs, I went to India for summer vacations, which is what we always did. And I was just really depressed and unhappy and wanting to harm myself. And it was just a period where I sort of like, I didn't have any goals. I didn't know what was happening. I think this was before the results came out as well. So there was an extra, like, what if I didn't do as well as I'd hoped? And thankfully, we had talked about psychology and mental health and seeing a psychologist in school briefly. And I sort of read about it online. So I was like, I think I need to see someone. And I was very, very lucky that my parents were super supportive. I still remember my mom was with me, but my dad was back in Hong Kong. And I told my mom, and I was like, hey, I think I'm really unhappy. I don't know, like, I'm like, my body image was down the drain, and everything was just sort of all over the place. And she was like, it's okay. It's your teenage years. It's your phase. It'll be fine. But on the phone to my dad, he was like, you want to see a psychologist? Let's set it up. Let's ask and let's do it. Because if that's what you think you need, then let's get it in place. And I've just been super, super thankful that they were ready and open.
And, back then, obviously, for classmates to see a fellow classmate going to see a psychologist, it might not be the most common thing for them. Like, did people back then know about you going to see a psychologist? And, what were their reactions?
Yeah, it was sort of my top secret that only my closest friends.
Oh, wow.
I would only, if you're in my close circle, will I reveal it to you. Thankfully, I was able to schedule things after school, so it didn't disrupt school too much, at least in the first couple of months when it wasn't as bad. But then I think towards mid year 12 is when I started associating school with sort of a darkness. So along with the depressive symptoms, unfortunately, I also had some psychosis. So for me, that took a form of dementors from the Harry Potter books. So for those who don't know, it's this creature that sucks the happiness out of you. Quite literally. So it was a great image for what I was feeling. But for school, for me, was like always darker than the rest of the world. Like my home specifically was warm, but anywhere outside was dark and cold and miserable. So by that time, I'd found a psychiatrist as well because I think at least at that stage, depression could possibly be managed primarily by therapy. But for psychosis, my psychologist recommended seeing a psychiatrist. So I'd started seeing him as well, and we were experimenting with medication, which again was a whole other roller coaster we can get into. But I think over time I sort of stopped going to school as much, or like if I was in school, I'd leave early. Again, super thankful for school being open for me to do that.
Mm.
But going back to your original question about friends, it was really hard to explain to them and be like, oh, I'm not well, or I have a doctor's appointment, or but I think slowly I needed to share with more people as it was happening. And so it wasn't something that was, I guess it was taboo, but thankfully my close friends were supportive.
Yeah, I mean, from what you described, I guess maybe some people would also consider that you were fortunate in the sense of you had a pretty solid, support system.
Yeah.
Your family was quite supportive and open-minded about talking about your mental health challenges and letting you seek help. And your friends, you at least maintained a sort of like a close circle where you could talk about that
Yeah.
a little bit more openly. And your school was also okay with making a certain arrangements for you because I think during the past few episodes, when different guests talked about different periods of their lives battling mental health challenges, a lot of them probably shared that experience of they started feeling or coming across these challenges during their school years, but then it was also a very awkward period where they couldn't really talk about their mental health challenges openly, and then they were also a bit too young to realize what exactly that they were going through. So for yourself, after seeing a psychologist and eventually seeing a psychiatrist, at what point did you come to the stage where you thought you had to seek some sort of medical diagnosis or something like that?
Yeah. It was my 17th birthday, and again, because I was so deep into Harry Potter, um, this fantasy that I'd created for myself, the sort of
Mm.
psychosis, I was convinced that my psychologist was sort of this gateway into the other world. She was a witch and she was here. And 17 is significant in Harry Potter literature because it means it's the age that you turn an adult. And I was like, okay, maybe I missed my Hogwarts letter, but now
Mm.
they're gonna welcome me and enter me into this other world. And and I had a session with her that day, and I was telling her all of this, and she was just like, I think we need to see a psychiatrist. And then once that was set in place, I think it, I think I was open to medication pretty early on. I was just suffering and struggling so much that I was like, and I'll take anything at this point that will help me. I will try anything. Um, the more medication I took and the more it impacted me in a multitude of ways, I became a little skeptical, especially because initially I was misdiagnosed with sort of depression and schizophrenic elements, I think. And so it took, I think, almost 2 years before I was diagnosed as bipolar. And during that period, um, the side effects are insane. Honestly, the types of side effects I've had, I think the biggest one is sleep. I was easily sleeping 12, 14 hours a day. And then it just felt like my brain was a lot slower. My body wasn't cooperating. I was gaining weight. I was losing weight depending on the medication. Um, I've taken one medication that literally made my hand shake, where I wasn't able to like pick up anything because my hand was shaking so bad. So it's not something that I take lightly, but at the same time, I think once I was on the right medication and seeing the change in myself, I was like, okay, there is a reason that I've been prescribed this. There's a reason this exists. And if I want to live any sort of stable life, then it's necessary.
And obviously, equipped with all those years of trying to overcome mental health challenges during your teenage years, if you were to give your teenage self advice, if you were to tell her something that you have learned over the years, what is it that you would like to say to her?
I think the biggest thing is it gets better. Hold on in there. It gets better. It's challenging right now, but you're taking the right steps to make it get better. So just hold on, have faith, and keep going. But also, I think one of the ways that more recently I've dealt with it is that this is not a weakness. It's not something that's holding me back. Yes, it impacts my day-to-day life. It impacts a lot of my decisions. But it's not this sort of evil thing that makes me different from everyone else, it's not all bad.
Mm.
It's something that you need to embrace.
Yes, yes. And I mean, obviously, a lot of us, when we were going through the darkest periods of our lives, seeing these words, we might think, oh, I don't believe you. I don't,
Hmm.
I see no end. But
Yeah.
you just have to believe.
Yeah.
You just have to pick yourself up, because at the end of the day, you're the only person who can pick yourself up.
Yeah.
And I know that the other thing, after you have, gone through years of your mental health challenges, that you also made it a point, the importance of finding a therapist who is culturally competent for yourself. Can you walk us through that idea? Like, how can one go about finding a therapist that's right?
Yeah. So I have seen three therapists over the course of my experience so far. The first one was this incredible French lady. And then when I was in New York, I was seeing a white American person. And both of them were great. Both of them were right at the time. But I think moving forward, like you said, I wanted someone who was culturally competent, who sort of understood the nuances of my lived experience. Because a lot of what we did, unfortunately, in my first and second therapist was very white influence. So we talked a lot about individualism versus collectivism. And their argument was that yes, India is a collectivist society, but now you're living in a more of an individualistic society. So you need to adapt and you need to sort of set boundaries with your parents or um, have explain to them why you are a separate entity, etc. All of this is very relevant and true, but also I think it's sort of not taking the full picture. I do come from a collectivist society, and part of now that I'm back living with my parents after a very long time, it's something that it's not just like my way or the highway. It's finding ways to work with each other, and put the family unit maybe not ahead of myself, but high enough as a priority, because I'm living with them and it's a part of it. And so that's why I think this time around, when I was looking for a therapist, the two sort of things that were quite important to me was one, someone who understood Indian or South Asian sort of background and culture, and someone who was also either trained or has experience in working with queer individuals. So I think I got lucky. I managed to find someone, but the difference that I've sort of seen is like it's small things. I can mention Diwali or a food, and they just kind of get it. Or I think the biggest thing right now is I'm 28 is the marriage pressure that's prevalent not just in my home but sort of across my circles, my family, friends. My dad's teacher today was asking me if I'm dating anyone and what are my plans, and I'm like, I don't know. It's not on the books right now. Like, um, thanks, but no thanks. She was like, I have a cousin who's single. I'm like, no
Oh
thanks.
dear.
I'm good.
Wow, I mean, what you just pointed out is so interesting as well, because when it comes to the conversation around mental health, a lot of the times it would be spoken or seen from the Western angle. That conversation is also quite opened up in a Western world. So, in a sense, resources and access to help would be, a lot more compared to the Asian context.
Absolutely.
And these days, even for us to find someone who is who's capable of doing this whole psychiatry practice with the Asian context, I would still say it's relatively rare.
Yeah.
And even if they exist, they would either be there would be barriers that come with it. Obviously, maybe the price tag, maybe that person just becomes really busy and not everyone would be able to access. So while I don't have a solution for these, but I
Yeah.
think these are also some of the issues that are worth highlighting.
Absolutely. And it's also not like every Indian therapist would work. I spoke to, I think, three or four, and then there was just sort of either issues with the way that they, like their mode of practice was very different to what I've been used to. So I have always been in psychoanalytic. I've worked with psychoanalytic individuals, and that is very different to the CBT approach that a lot of psychologists take. Both have their merits. It's just this is what I was used to, so I was keen to continue on this track, or at least find someone who uses multiple number of modalities. Or there was someone I saw who had a very strong spiritual aspect to their practice. And a lot of it was sort of drawing from Hinduism and sort of those aspects, which is fascinating, but is perhaps a step too far for me as an agnostic or atheist. I don't want to be in a therapeutic relationship where spirituality is such a large part of how they work, or someone who is the idea is to, for them, the conversation with them ended up being like, oh, you should take these vitamins and we're going to try and work to reduce your medicines. Because like you said, in Asia so far, this space just isn't regulated. So it's much harder to find someone who, one, fits all the boxes for you personally, but also at a larger scale. What they're doing in line with global psychological practices? Because I could argue some of the people I saw weren't necessarily practicing the way that would be accepted in other parts of the world.
And taking a step back, right, when it comes to maybe causes of mental health issues with the Asian context, a lot of people would mention that they started, like I mentioned earlier, they started experiencing mental health challenges during their school years as they were about to go into public exams or, some sort of exams that would help them get into uni. What's your view on the education system in Hong Kong or in the overall Asian context? Do you think it kills mental health a little bit?
Yes, I think it definitely makes things a lot harder being so. I think I've seen this across my friend circle as well. I think most, and this might be truer for third culture kids than other individuals, but there's this strong sort of achievement orientation, I guess is the easiest way to describe it. And that adds a lot of pressure as for someone who's only 13, 14, 15. For me, I think intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation is far more likely to be beneficial for your mental health. If you're not if you're not driven by the grades, there was this book I read a while ago, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and one part that really stood out to me was they were describing a classroom which wasn't, which they didn't, the outcome had no grades. Everyone would get an A, everyone would pass, and so the only idea was how do the individuals show up in class. And sure, they had a population that dropped out maybe 10-15%, but then the rest of the class that decided to continue and show up actually just showed a lot of creativity, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of intrinsic motivation. And I think it's worth examining what happens when you remove these like external achievements or external sort of like benchmarks of what good is, and then you really sort of nail down on what truly motivates an individual, what excites them, what unleashes that creativity. I think it could be a really fascinating world that we live in if we didn't have so many external expectations and
Yeah.
things to sort of achieve.
Yeah, what you just pointed out is very, very important because before you pointed it out, I think a lot of us would not even be aware. This is how the education system shapes us. We are always programmed to work hard or because we were trying to achieve something rather than really looking inward in the sense of, is this what I really want? Or is this what will make me appear to be successful in the society, in the external world? And we rarely look inward about what exactly that we enjoy, that we are passionate about. And also, obviously, with education, there would be a lot of, expectations for students around how, like, I need to get into a good school in order to make my parents proud, in order to get a good job. And this is where the stress could come from because all these good schools aren't necessarily for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Before we dive into that, I think the biggest, a great example of this I saw in a close friend of mine. Like a lot of Asian kids, she was put into piano classes really early on, and it was all about like achieving the grades and going next and next and next. And sure, she did it because she wanted to, but after a while, picked up bass where she didn't learn it. She didn't learn it with anyone. She just sort of did her own thing. She was just experimenting, having fun. And now she has a crazy following on YouTube.
Wow.
So, like, if you're doing something just because you want to, I think you're going to put a lot more effort and interest into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always that discussion around, should I be doing something that will make me look good? Or should I be doing something that I'm passionate about, that I will eventually get so good at it that people can't look away from me?
Exactly.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, now currently you're pursuing what you're passionate about, writing.
Yeah.
And recently you had an article published on Vice. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
You talked about the misconceptions about mental health, such as the difference between mental health and mental well being. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, I think the article stemmed from, like you said, there was Mental Health Awareness Day recently, and it was a little, for lack of a better word, annoying to see companies all talking a lot about like all of the things that they're offering. Someone I spoke to recently said that they have an Are You Okay Day where you just go around asking your colleagues instead of, hey, how are you? What's happening? Like, are you okay? Which in concept sounds interesting, but is it really getting into what's truly troubling a person or what's really happening in their life? And also a lot of the solutions that companies in particular are providing or sort of you hear is like, oh, meditate or do yoga or try these vitamins and try Chinese medicine, try acupuncture or try Reiki. These are all great things that can definitely support individuals in their what I call mental well-being journey. So mental well-being is not the absence of mental illnesses. It's the idea that you're living a more fulfilled, that you're working towards living a fulfilling life, what they called languishing. But I think it's also super important to separate out mental illnesses from that. Because I think the support needed around mental illness is very different to what is needed for one's mental well-being. So for me personally, as someone who has bipolar, my sleep schedule can be all over the place. Even today, I slept a little late yesterday. I slept around 12:30, but I woke up at 1:30 p.m. That just wouldn't be okay if I was working in a corporate, or like corporates aren't made to take that into consideration. It was my body's just sort of saying it's shut down. You are not allowed to function today. You just need to take some time off. You've been working too hard. And part of it is because of the bipolar, because of the medicines that I take, because of the way that my body reacts. And so I have lesser control over it in certain ways. Um, Other things, if I was in a depressive episode or in a manic episode, the way that I show up to work would be very different. And I am yet to find companies that are able to take my needs and make it work in a larger system. And I think that's why separating it out is important because, yes, we should all work towards mental wellness and mental well-being because that impacts your mental illnesses and disorders, but they are, at least the way I'm approaching them, two separate things. So for disorders, for example, the key things are provide in your insurance, make sure therapy and psychiatric medication is covered.
Mm,
It is so expensive. I again have been super lucky that I've been able to afford it, but it's like I've had to cut down on other things over time, or I've had to ask my parents for support early on, for me to be able to do all of this. And then also I think it's just about working with individuals and meeting them where they are. Um, Someone who has ADHD or OCD would have a lot different requirements to someone who's feeling stress or burnout.
yeah.
We've started to do it in school. We're offering accommodations in school, so I think it's worth thinking about offering accommodations in the workplace. But I think companies sort of get away, at least so far, by doing all the things for mental well-being without taking mental health into consideration and sort of combining the two. So they're sort of really excited. They're like, "Oh, we offer free spas
Yeah.
for
Free
our
massage.
free massage." I'm like, "That's great, but that's not going to solve my bipolar disorder. Please pay for my medication. Thank you."
Exactly. And I do see, yeah, currently a lot of those mental well being initiatives done by companies is more, better for the PR and marketing efforts. It's more for like the photo opportunities rather than, having real effects. But then I'm still grateful that obviously the importance of mental well being has been taken notice in the corporate world and people are actively trying to do something. And also with the COVID pandemic, as the world embraced a slightly more, hybrid type of work mode, it has opened up the conversation about the concept of the traditional 9 to 5 office life is not for everyone. And it's actually a bit crazy to think that, so many people work in the corporate world, that amount of population, they are expected to behave the same, to need the same thing. It's a bit crazy, now that when you think about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. Just I understand where it's coming from. It came from sort of the need to manage thousands of people in factory at one time, but we're not. Firstly, a lot of us are no longer in factory jobs, and secondly, individual differences need to be taken into consideration. It's you can't blanket
Yeah.
us on everyone, and
That's so true. I would like to get some of your thoughts about workplace transformation because I know this is also an area that you have studied about and also you have worked in. Because before you became a full time writer, you worked in HR and people operations for a number of years. I'm just wondering what were some of the key learnings and observations that you made during your time working at places like the United Nations Population Fund and McKinsey?
yeah, absolutely. And also my master. I think I'm going to be drawing more from the literature on my master's, which was in organizational psychology.
Hmm.
But I think one of the key things that companies and leaders need to do is build psychological safety. And that's sort of the concept that it's okay to make mistakes. Like, you don't need to be perfect all the time in the workplace. I think, in terms of our leaders, it means being vulnerable and being open and sort of talking about what challenges they've faced and how that's impacted their workplace. But yeah, the thing that we used to practice in groups and teams, especially, is just spending the first 2 to 3 to 5 minutes just checking in to see where everyone is. And of course, at the beginning, everyone was just like, "Yeah, we're fine, we're good, we're good." But then over time, it's great to just sort of have a feeling of like, "Hey, I'm really exhausted today. Like, kid didn't sleep all night," or yeah, I'm super excited. I have some stuff coming up this weekend, and I can't wait for it. And just getting this out in the open, it changes the way that you work with each other. So, for example, the person who hadn't gotten any sleep and isn't super enthusiastic in the meeting, isn't able to contribute, it could change the way that you look at them. You could at first look at them, they're being lazy or they're spaced out, they're not interested. But once you sort of know their context, it changes the way that you interact with them and how you work together. So I think it's just sort of these small things. It doesn't even need to be something revolutionary. It's about a number of small things put together that aligns with your vision and mission. If your vision and mission includes having a healthy, engaged workforce, then these things sort of trickle down. So it trickles down and it trickles up. So it's a little bit of both. But the leader does set the tone for a lot of these things. And I think there are, at least I've seen instances, especially with smaller companies, of people doing this better. But I'm keen for bigger companies as well. I heard, like, for example, one of the things that I'm not, and I don't know if you know about Meta's big restructuring and laying off people that's happening, but apparently Mark Zuckerberg was just very cold about it. He mentioned it and then he moved on to other stuff that he's working on, and it was just like the entire workforce was just like, you're letting off 10% of all employees, and there is not an ounce of sympathy in your in in your voice. So that creates sort of a disconnect for the workers.
And from what you just mentioned there, right, you would think, this kind of approach, it's more important to be top down than bottom up. Is that right?
I think it works both ways. I think it is very important to get the buy-in from the top, but individuals at the bottom can also start it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've, for example, gone to my previous employers and been like, hey, I need this. And so you need to make it happen. So for me, it was always about sort of like, hey, I have doctor's appointments or I need a day off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess at the end, do need the leaders' buy-in.
Yeah, I agree there needs to be a balance between that top down and bottom up, because obviously the downside about this kind of initiative being a bit too bottom up is that it could cause issues. For example, like
Yeah.
the top management could use that as an excuse, as in like, oh, if the mid management and junior staff aren't saying anything, I assume that everything is okay. But when things aren't okay in reality, the top management could also blame the mid management people as well as the junior people. So why didn't you say? I didn't know that was a problem, and it's your responsibility to tell me because we are doing this bottom up
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, I think that's why surveys are so important. Employee engagement tools are super duper important to have. I know they can be long and tedious and nobody really wants to fill them out, but they're really key to getting a sense of where everyone is and not just limiting it to the survey. Once you get the survey, you have to act on it. Or, for example, there's like an interesting result out in like finance is way less motivated than the rest of the company, then you go in and have a conversation with the finance team and find out what's happening in finance. What could be the reason for this dissatisfaction?
Yeah. And I mean, just taking a step back for this conversation, I know that you studied organizational psychology at Columbia University, which you mentioned earlier. But for those who aren't really familiar with the concept, can you help us understand, what does organizational psychology mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the easiest way to describe it is the psychology of the workplace, of how individuals, teams, companies are working. And what I loved about it is that we broke it down into those levels and tackled issues for companies at all of these levels. So, for example, we'll work at the individual level, looking at motivation, looking at performance. How do you train and develop a person so that they could one day be the CEO? What kind of learning does the individual need to be successful in their job and to be happy in their job? What are their motivations? What are the things that they need to take into consideration when coming into work every day? And then the next level is at the team level. And this is, again, very interesting because it can be inter teams, so with like across teams, how about two teams interacting? So for example, HR always gets blamed of being sort of the bad guy uh, in organizations, and sales is always like, oh, HR made us do this, but what does that mean? And like, is that hindering the HR folk to be able to do their work? And how do we get over this? So this could include interventions that happen, say for HR. It could be once you've diagnosed the issue, it could be, oh, the two leaders of the two groups have beef, and that's why it's trickled down to the whole teams. Or there's just this perception that HR is the bad guy and they're sort of being very strict with us when actually the rules are coming from somewhere else, or they're legal rules that HR is trying to follow. And so to get over how to create synergies between the two teams, like what are the interventions that we could do? And intra team is, or intra group is my personal passion, is how individuals in a group show up and how do you make them perform the best. So for the biggest part is, of course, like whatever the team is for, is to ensuring you have a mission or like a goal.
I mean, what you just mentioned there, factors, for example, like office politics were also considered in the study that you did. And, it could be as trivial as someone just does not get along with another team member. But for these, obviously, these sound relatively small, but then they could cause really fundamental harm to the overall motivation and productivity of the company, of the team. So, how can we go about solving these issues?
The first step is diagnosis in the way that we approached organizational psychology. So it's not just like, oh, this person has an issue with that person. There could be a multitude of reasons for that. It could be that it could be a race issue, for example, that which we found a lot of. Like there are some assumptions about race that make them not get along, or there could be that they are projecting something onto the person. So, for example, the rest of this organization can project onto the marketing team that, oh, they just spend money and they are like sort of the fun guys. They're just always like trying all of these things and there are no consequences for them. And that could create beef between individuals. So if a marketing person is going to join the finance, that like a group with a number of different people, the fact that they're representing marketing could mean something, and that could cause the friction.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess it's really just about diagnosing what the issue really is. It could also be that one's a mother and one's not a mother, and what does that represent, and what is that saying about the overall culture? Perhaps we're not inclusive of mothers, or the way that the systems have been designed make it feel like it's unfair for the people who are not mothers. So perhaps, yes, it could be about these two individuals, but it's probably also about the whole system.
In your view, is it ever possible for an organization to create a good culture? Because normally these days with corporations, employees tend to have very low satisfaction and they would decide to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they quit, when they go into their exit interviews, they are already expecting that, no matter, what kind of inputs that they are going to give during the exit interviews, it's not going to make a difference. This is certainly a very depressing view of, how a company operates and, the whole corporate culture.
Yeah.
Is there a way to change this to make it a little bit more hopeful for everyone?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely really hard. And I think it's the misconception that if you put people first, profits will struggle. Whereas I think from what I've found is putting the people first, actually, which includes customers. Customers are part of the people, but like putting your employees first really can improve profits and sales and everything. Investing in individuals, yeah, so sort of the basic thing is like, oh, I don't want to invest in this person. What if they leave? But the answer to that is, what if they don't? so this person is just staying and you haven't invested in them. You're not increasing their capacity for work and output. So I think if companies started to put people first, yeah, I think the culture would improve.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely a very insightful chat, but it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. And in this segment, I'll be asking my guests biased questions they've got asked at some point in life. So, Kopal, are you ready?
Excited, yes.
First question. Where is your accent from? You don't sound Indian.
I don't know what you think Indian sounds like, but I am very much Indian. Yes, I grew up in Hong Kong and I was in the US for a bit, but I think you need to all Indians don't sound the same, and we're not all Apu or Mindy Kaling. We have our own accents. There's regional accents, there's international accents, so perhaps you just need to look at it yourself a little bit more.
Very well said. And next up, you're not Asian, you're brown.
Oh my god. Just have you seen a map? India is part of Asia. But it was really funny, actually. I was watching a comedian today that was talking about Rishi Sunak, the new prime minister, and he's like, yeah, we're not excited. He's not Asian. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
But next one.
Yes.
If you are from China, why don't you speak Chinese?
I am an expat, and not everyone in China, or well, specifically Hong Kong, speaks Chinese. First of all, Chinese is also not correct because there's Mandarin and Cantonese. And secondly, a lot of the Hong Kong population speaks English, and so I've never really had to learn Chinese.
The next one is, having mental health issues means you're crazy.
I think that would mean that everyone's crazy. We all have our struggles, and that doesn't make us mad, crazy, weird. It just makes us human.
And finally, you don't need to take medication for your mental health. Just try yoga, meditation, acupuncture. It worked for me.
I am really glad it worked for you, but if I'm sick, I'm gonna do everything I can to take care of it. And unfortunately, mental bipolar is an illness and a disorder. And next time, perhaps when you have stomach ache or the flu, try not taking the medication for a day or two and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you very much for answering this round of rapid bias. Those were some pretty crazy questions, I would say.
Yeah.
And to wrap up the episode, Kopal, I know that you have decided to only read books by Asian authors in the year of 2022. It's sort of like an experiment and challenge for yourself. I'm so curious, how's that going for you so far? And what are some of the highlights that you could share with us?
Oh my God, absolutely amazing. I have loved reading Asian authors. I have read the one that started this all was this beautiful book called Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which is written by a Japanese author and has been translated to English and is doing really well. And it's just, the tone is different. First of all, it's a lot more relatable. I've read books based in Hong Kong, and it's giving me a new insight that I never had when I'm reading. And then the tone tends to be so different as well. Japanese authors are a lot more, at least I've found that, engage in a lot more magical realism and sort of that day-to-day intricacies that makes life interesting. Korean authors talk a lot about social issues, or at least the books that I've read, and that's been fascinating. I guess it's two things that have happened. One is that it's helped me identify a lot more with the books that I'm reading and feel like they connect with me a lot more. And then at the same time, it's giving me insights into cultures that I'm not a part of, that are outside whiteness.
The beautiful thing in life is that that there's so much out there for you to explore. I mean, it's so beautiful to just learn about something that's completely unfamiliar to you. So I'm so glad that you're doing this challenge and you have,
Yeah.
so many highlights. And by the end of the year, like if I get to meet you, tell me more about all the books that you have read so far.
For sure. I'm going to eventually there's an article that's going to come out.
Ooh,
Not sure
nice.
where or when, but I will write about this. And then the challenge for next year is to read only queer authors. So I'm super excited for that too.
Before we go, finally, I just have one more question for you, Kopo.
Of course.
What does it mean to be proudly Asian to you?
Being proudly Asian is a combination of everything. I think it's a combination of being born in India and having an Indian background, living in Hong Kong, and also just loving Asian food. Give me pho, give me Thai food, and I will be a very happy person.
I love how you put it because a lot of people would think that the identity, the label Asian only means one thing, but in fact, it means so many different layers of cultures, cuisines, thinkings, and ideologies. There's so much that's packed into this one word, Asian. So thank you so much, Kopo, for joining us for Proudly Asian. It's great chatting with you.
Yes, this was so much fun, and thank you so much for having me, Isabel.
That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at proudly.asian for more content. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a 5-star review on wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and signing off for now. I'm Isabel Wong.